The letter trembled in my hands, its edges worn, the ink faded but sharp enough to cut. I stood in the foyer of the old family mansion, the air thick with dust and the ghosts of a life I thought I'd left behind. The chandelier above me flickered, casting jagged shadows across the marble floor, and I could feel them watching. My family, or what was left of them, their silhouettes looming in the doorway to the parlor. Not real ghosts, no, but the weight of their secrets, their betrayals, pressing against me like a storm about to break. I was 62, and I'd spent decades running from this place, from the truth folded in my hands. But now here I was, back in the house where it all began, the letter forcing me to face what I'd buried so long ago. The mansion hadn't changed much, though time had gnawed at its edges. The wallpaper peeled in thin curls, the once polished banister was dull with neglect, and the smell of mildew clung to everything. I'd driven up from the city that morning, my old sedan rattling over the gravel drive, the oaks lining the path as stern as ever, their branches clawing at the grey sky. I hadn't wanted to come. I'd told myself I was done with this place, with the family that had torn itself apart before I was old enough to understand why. But the letter arrived last week, slipped into my mailbox with no return address, and the moment I saw my sister's handwriting, Clara's tight, elegant script, I knew I couldn't stay away. Clara was gone, had been for 3 years. Her heart giving out in a hospital bed while I was halfway across the country, teaching history to bored college kids. We hadn't spoken in decades, not since the fight that broke us, but her death hit me harder than I expected. I'd stood in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear as my cousin broke the news, and felt a hollow ache, like I'd lost something I didn't know I still had. The letter was her last word, written before she died, and it wasn't an apology or a farewell. It was a confession, one that cracked open the past and let the truth spill out like blood. I walked to the parlor, my footsteps echoing in the empty house, the letter still in my hand. The furniture was covered in dusty sheets, the fireplace cold, but I could still see it the way it was. My mother at the piano, her fingers hesitant on the keys, my father pacing, his voice low and sharp, Clara always watching, her eyes catching everything. I was the youngest, the quiet one, the one who stayed out of the way while the family unraveled. I was 16 when it happened, when the fight that changed everything tore through this house like a fire. I didn't understand it then, not fully. Just whispers about money, land, a will. But I knew it broke us. My father left, my mother faded, and Clara became someone I didn't recognize. I sat on the edge of a covered sofa, the fabric rough under my hands, and unfolded the letter again. Margaret, it began, my name in her careful hand. I've carried this too long. You deserve to know what happened, what I did. I'm sorry it's taken me until now. My chest tightened as I read, the words pulling me back to that summer, 1978, when everything fell apart. The letter told a story I'd only half guessed, a story of greed, of betrayal, of a family that chose money over love. Clara wrote about our father's will, how he'd left the bulk of his estate, the mansion, the land, the investments, to me, the youngest, because he thought I was the only one who'd keep it safe. Clara, 22 then, had been furious. She'd always been the golden child, the one who charmed everyone, but she wanted more than charm. She wanted power. She'd forged documents, convinced our mother, who was too broken to fight, to sign them, and redirected the inheritance to herself. By the time I was old enough to question it, the estate was hers, the mansion leased out, the land sold off piece by piece. I'd been told there was nothing left, that father's debts had eaten it all. I believed it because why wouldn't I? I was a kid, grieving, lost. Clara moved away, built a life of wealth and distance, while I scraped by, teaching, renting small apartments, never quite understanding why I felt so cheated. I folded the letter, my hands steady but my heart racing. The parlor was dim, the light from the tall windows gray and thin. I thought about my mother, the way she'd sit in this room after Father left, staring at the garden, her coffee growing cold. "Life's not fair, Margaret," she'd say, her voice flat, like she'd given up long before I was born. I was 12 when she taught me to make bread, her hands guiding mine through the dough, the kitchen warm with yeast and sunlight. "You keep going," she'd said, "no matter what." I hadn't understood then, but I did now. She'd been talking about herself, about surviving a marriage that drained her, a daughter who betrayed her, a life that didn't turn out the way she'd hoped. I stood, my knees stiff, and walked to the window. The garden was overgrown, the roses choked with weeds, but I could still see us there, Clara and me, kids, chasing fireflies, our laughter bright against the dusk. She'd been my hero once, my big sister, the one who braided my hair and told me stories about pirates and queens. How had we become strangers? How had she chosen money over me? I pressed my hand to the glass, the cold seeping into my palm, and felt the old anger stir. Not hot like it used to be, but heavy, like a stone I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was there. I'd spent years blaming myself, thinking I'd done something to drive her away. I'd lie awake in my tiny apartment, the radiator clanking, and wonder what I'd missed, what I could have said to keep her close. I'd see her face in dreams, her smile sharp, her eyes distant, and wake up with an ache I couldn't name. But the letter changed everything. It wasn't me. It was her choices, her greed, her fear of being less than she wanted to be. I wasn't the one who broke us. I left the parlor, my steps slow, and climbed the staircase to the second floor. The air was heavier up here, the silence deeper, like the house was holding its breath. I stopped at Clara's old room, the door ajar, and pushed it open. The bed was stripped, the dresser empty, but I could still see her there, sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair, her reflection sharp in the mirror. I was 10, sneaking in to borrow her earrings, and she'd caught me, her laugh soft. "Your trouble, Maggie," she'd said, slipping the earrings into my hand. "But you're my trouble." I stood there now, 62, the memory so vivid it hurt, and wondered how that girl had become the woman who'd stolen from me. I didn't cry. I wanted to, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I felt a quiet resolve, like a fire kindling in my chest. I wasn't here to mourn Clara, or the family we'd been. I was here to reclaim what was mine. Not the money, not the land, but the truth. The strength I'd buried under years of doubt. I walked back downstairs, the letter in my pocket, and stood in the foyer again. The chandelier flickering above me. The shadows were still there, my family's ghosts, but they didn't scare me anymore. I was done running. I drove back to the city that night, the mansion fading in my rearview mirror, the stars bright above the highway. My apartment was waiting, small but warm, the kettle on the counter, my books stacked on the coffee table. I made tea, the steam curling in the lamplight, and sat at my kitchen table, the letter spread out before me. I thought about my father, the way he'd carry me on his shoulders through the garden, his voice rumbling with stories of his youth. "You're my legacy, Margaret," he'd said once, his hand warm on mine. I hadn't understood then, but I did now. He'd trusted me, and Clara had taken that trust, twisted it, made it something ugly. But it wasn't too late to honor him, to honor myself, to The next morning I woke to the sound of rain tapping against my apartment window, a soft, steady rhythm that matched the quiet resolve still burning in my chest. I made coffee, the familiar hiss of the machine grounding me, and stood at the counter, watching the steam rise. The letter sat on the table, its edges curling slightly. Clara's words a weight I could feel even from across the room. I didn't read it again, not yet. Instead, I sipped my coffee, the mug warm in my hands, and let my mind wander back to the mansion, to the life I'd left behind, to the woman I'd become despite it all. I was 62, retired from teaching, living on a modest pension in a one-bedroom apartment with creaky floors and a view of the city's rooftops. It wasn't the life I'd imagined when I was young, when I dreamed of writing novels or traveling the world. But it was a good life, built from small, hard-won moments, grading papers late at night, laughing with students over their earnest debates, tending the potted herbs on my windowsill. I'd always told myself I didn't need much, that I was content with what I had. But Clara's letter had cracked that open, showing me how much I'd lost, how much had been taken. And now, I couldn't unsee it. I spent the day sorting through old boxes, ones I'd shoved into the closet years ago and never opened. They were full of relics from my past, photo albums, letters, a scarf my mother had knitted, its wool still soft despite the years. I found a picture of Clara and me, taken the summer before everything fell apart. We were in the mansion's garden, our arms around each other, the sun bright on our faces. I was 15, all gangly limbs and shy smiles. Clara was 21, her hair long, her eyes sharp with ambition. I touched the photo, my finger tracing her face, and felt a pang of grief, not for the sister I'd lost, but for the one I'd loved, the one who'd existed before greed changed her. I remembered a moment from that summer, sitting on the porch with my father. He was smoking a pipe, the sweet tobacco curling in the air, and I was reading, my legs tucked under me. "You've got a good heart, Margaret," he'd said, his voice low, like he was sharing a secret. "Don't let the world take that from you." I'd nodded, not really understanding, but his words stayed with me, a quiet anchor through the years. He'd died a year later, a heart attack that came without warning, and the mansion became a battleground, Clara and our mother fighting over his will, while I hid in my room, trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. I put the photo down, my hands trembling, and opened another box. There were legal documents, old bank statements, things I'd kept without knowing why. I wasn't a lawyer, but I'd always been good at piecing things together. Dates, names, numbers. I spread the papers on my table, the rain still falling outside, and started reading. Clara's letter had mentioned the forged documents, the ones she'd used to redirect Father's estate. I didn't expect to find proof, not after all these years, but there it was, a copy of the will, tucked in a folder I hadn't touched in decades. My name was there, in black and white, listed as the primary heir, just like Clara had said. I stared at it, my breath shallow, and felt the past shift, like a puzzle piece snapping into place. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the table, the lamp casting a warm circle around me, and read through everything, bank records, letters, notes I'd scribbled as a teenager, trying to understand what was happening. By dawn I had a picture, not complete, but clear enough. Clara had worked with a lawyer, someone our mother trusted to alter the will. They'd sold the land piece by piece, and Clara had pocketed the money, building a life of wealth while I was told there was nothing left. Our mother had known, or at least suspected, but she'd been too weak, too broken to fight, and me, I'd been too young, too trusting to question it. The rain had stopped, the city quiet in the early light. I made more coffee, My hands moving on instinct, and stood at the window. Watching the rooftops glisten, I thought about my mother, the way she'd fade into silence after father died, her hands shaking as she poured tea. I remembered her funeral 10 years after his, and how Clara hadn't come, sending a card instead, her handwriting cold and formal. I'd stood at the grave, alone, the wind sharp against my face, and felt like I'd lost more than just her. I'd lost the family I thought we were. I could have let it go. I could have folded the will back into its folder, put the boxes away, and kept living my quiet life. But something in me wouldn't let it. Not anger, not anymore, but a need to set things right, to honor my father, to reclaim what was mine. I wasn't after money. Most of it was gone, spent or hidden in accounts I'd never trace. This was about truth, about standing up for the girl I'd been, the one who'd trusted her sister and lost everything. I called a lawyer that morning, a woman named Ellen I'd met years ago at a teaching conference. She was retired now, but sharp, with a no-nonsense voice that put me at ease. I told her everything. Clara's letter, the will, the documents. She listened, her pen scratching in the background, and when I finished, she said she'd look into it. "It's a long shot, Margaret," she warned, her tone gentle but firm. "After all this time, the legal options are slim, but we can try." I thanked her, my throat tight, and hung up, feeling a strange mix of hope and resignation. This wasn't about winning. Not really. It was about fighting, about saying, "Asterisk, I see what you did, and it wasn't right." The weeks that followed were a blur of phone calls, emails, and trips to the library, where I dug through old records, my glasses slipping down my nose. Ellen was methodical, tracking down the lawyer who'd worked with Clara. Now, an old man in a nursing home. He didn't remember much, but he confirmed enough. Clara had come to him, young and persuasive, with a story about debts and a family in crisis. It wasn't enough for a lawsuit, not after 40 years, but it was enough for me. I had the truth, or as much of it as I'd ever get, and that was a kind of victory, quiet but real. I went back to the mansion one last time, a cold March morning, the air sharp with the promise of spring. The house looked smaller somehow, less imposing, its windows dark, its walls sagging under the weight of time. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps soft, and felt the ghosts again. Not angry now, but tired, like they were ready to rest. I stood in the parlor, the fireplace still cold, and thought about Clara, about the letter, about the choices that had brought us here. I didn't hate her, not anymore. I saw her now, not as a villain, but as a woman who'd been afraid, who'd wanted so much she'd lost sight of what mattered. I forgave her, not because she deserved it, but because I deserved to be free. I left the mansion that day, the will in my bag, the letter in my pocket. I didn't need to keep the house, didn't need to fight for what was gone. I'd reclaimed something better, my voice, my strength, my father's trust. I drove back to the city, the highway stretching out before me, the sky breaking into light. My apartment was waiting, the herbs on the windowsill green and alive, the kettle ready for tea. I sat at my table, the photo of Clara and me beside me, and felt a peace I hadn't known I could find. The past was still there, its shadows long, but I wasn't running anymore. I was home, in myself, in the life I'd built, one truth at a time. The city welcomed me back with its familiar hum, car horns, footsteps, the distant wail of a siren weaving through the morning air. I parked my sedan in the garage below my building, the engine ticking as it cooled, and carried the weight of the mansion's silence up the stairs to my apartment. The will and Clara's letter stayed in my bag, but their presence followed me, like a shadow I could feel but not see. I set the kettle on, the soft click of the stove grounding me and stood at the window, watching the rooftops shimmer under a thin layer of frost. I was 62, and for the first time in years, I felt the past not as a burden, but as a map, showing me where I'd been and how far I'd come. Life settled into its rhythm again, but it was different now, sharper, like the world had come into focus. I spent my days reading, gardening, meeting friends for coffee at the corner cafe, where the barista knew my order. Black, no sugar, with a splash of milk. I'd sit by the window, my notebook open, jotting down thoughts, memories, fragments of stories I hadn't yet told. The herbs on my windowsill were thriving, their leaves brushing against the glass, and I'd pinch a sprig of basil, its scent sharp and green, reminding me of my mother's kitchen, the way she'd hum as she chopped vegetables, her hands steady even when her heart wasn't. I thought about her a lot those days, about the woman she'd been before the mansion, before my father, before Clara's betrayal. I remembered a moment when I was 8, sitting on the floor of her bedroom, watching her brush her hair. The mirror caught the morning light, and she'd smiled at me, a real smile, not the tired one she wore later. "You're my dreamer, Margaret," she'd said, her voice soft like she was sharing a secret. I hadn't known what she meant, but I'd carried that moment with me, a flicker of warmth in the cold years that followed. She'd loved me, I knew now, but she'd been too broken to fight for me, for herself, for the family we could have been. I didn't blame her anymore. I just wished I could tell her I understood. Ellen, the lawyer, kept working, her emails steady but cautious. The trail was cold, she warned, the documents too old, the witnesses too scattered. But she found something, a record of a land sale, one of the last pieces of my father's estate, sold by Clara in the early 80s. The buyer was a developer, long gone, but the transaction was sloppy, the paperwork incomplete. "It's not much," Ellen said over the phone, her voice crackling with static. "But it might be enough to make a claim, at least for a small settlement." I listened, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and felt a quiet stir, not of greed, but of justice, of setting right what had been wrong for so long. I didn't expect money, not really. Most of Clara's wealth was gone, spent on a life of appearances, houses, cars, trips she'd bragged about in the few letters she'd sent before we stopped talking. But the idea of a claim, even a small one, felt like a way to honor my father, to say, asterisk, I see what you wanted for me, and I'm here to claim it. I told Ellen to keep going, to do what she could, and hung up. The apartment quiet, except for the hum of the radiator. I thought about my father, the way he'd sit in his study, his pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling, his voice low as he told me stories of his childhood on the farm that became the mansion's land. "It's yours, Margaret," he'd said once, his hand on my shoulder. "Not just the land, but the heart of it. Don't let anyone take that from you." I'd been too young to understand, but now, decades later, I did. I started writing again, not just notes, but a memoir, something I'd never thought I'd have the courage to do. I'd sit at my kitchen table, the lamp casting a soft glow, and let the words come. Stories of the mansion, of Clara, of my parents, of the girl I'd been and the woman I'd become. I wrote about the summer of 78, the fight that broke us, the way the air in the parlor had felt thick with secrets. I wrote about my mother's silence, my father's trust, Clara's greed. I wrote about the letter, the will, the truth that had set me free, not by giving me riches, but by giving me myself, by giving. The pages piled up, messy at first, then clearer, like I was carving a path through the weeds of my past. I shared the early chapters with my friend Ruth, a retired librarian who'd become my confidant over coffee and walks in the park. We'd meet at the cafe, her scarf bright against the grey of winter, and she'd read my pages, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "This is powerful, Margaret," she'd say, her voice steady but warm. "It's not just your story. It's every woman who's had to fight for her place." I'd smile, my throat tight, and think about my students, the ones I'd taught over the years, their faces eager or tired or defiant. I'd always told them history wasn't just dates and wars. It was people, their choices, their hearts. Now I was telling my own history, and it felt like a gift, not just to me, but to them, to anyone who'd ever felt erased. The twist came in April, quiet but seismic, like a crack in the earth you don't see until it's wide open. Ellen called me one morning, her voice different, not cautious but urgent. "Margaret," she said, "we found something, a trust set up by your father, separate from the will. It's small, but it's there, and it's in your name." I stood in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, my coffee forgotten on the counter. A trust. My father had hidden it, tucked it away where Clara's greed couldn't touch it. It wasn't much, enough for a modest savings, maybe a trip or two, but it was his last gift to me, his way of saying, "Asterisk, I see you, Margaret. I always did." I sat down, my legs shaky, and felt tears come, not the kind that hurt, but the kind that heal. I thought about my father, his pipe, his stories, the way he'd look at me like I was his whole world. I thought about the mansion, the garden, the fireflies Clara and I had chased. I thought about my mother, her hands guiding mine through dough, her voice saying, "Asterisk, you keep going." They were all there, in that moment, not as ghosts, but as roots, holding me steady. The trust wasn't about money. It was about trust, about knowing I'd been loved, about knowing I was enough. I drove to the mansion one last time, a warm May afternoon, the oaks along the drive blooming green. The house looked tired, its paint peeling, but there was a beauty to it, like an old woman who'd lived a full life. I walked through the rooms, the air softer now, the shadows gone. I stood in the foyer, the chandelier still flickering, and felt the past settle, not as a weight, but as a story, one I'd told, one I'd owned. I didn't need the house, didn't need the land. I had my father's trust, my mother's resilience, my own heart. That was enough. I left the mansion for good that day, the keys in my pocket, the will and Clara's letter in a box I'd donate to the Historical Society. I drove back to the city, the sun setting behind me, the sky a wash of gold and pink. My apartment was waiting, the herbs green, the kettle ready, my memoir growing on the table. I sat down, the locket I'd bought months ago warm against my skin, and wrote, not to escape, but to remember, to honor, to live. The past was there, its lessons deep, but I wasn't its prisoner anymore. I was Margaret, 62, a dreamer, a fighter, a woman who'd found her way home. Summer came to the city like a slow exhale, the air warm and heavy, the streets alive with the chatter of open windows and the hum of fans. I'd walk to the cafe in the mornings, my notebook tucked under my arm, and sit by the window, watching the world unfold. Mothers pushing strollers, delivery trucks rattling by, old men arguing over chess in the park across the street. My apartment was a sanctuary now, the herbs on the windowsill lush, the walls lined with books and photos, the locket around my neck a quiet reminder of the past I'd made peace with. I was 62, and life felt full, not in a loud way, but in the quiet, steady way a river feels full, carrying everything it's gathered along the way. The memoir was growing, page by page, its words a bridge between the girl I'd been and the woman I was now. I'd write in the evenings, the city's lights blinking outside, the lamp casting a soft glow over my table. I wrote about the mansion, its creaking floors and peeling wallpaper, but also about the smaller moments. The way my father's pipe smoke curled in the air, the sound of my mother's laughter before it faded, the fireflies Clara and I chased in the garden. I wrote about the letter, the will, the trust, not as a story of loss, but as one of finding, of reclaiming what was mine. Ruth read the drafts, her feedback sharp but kind, and her words stayed with me. You're not just telling a story, Margaret. You're giving people permission to tell theirs. Ellen, the lawyer, kept me updated, her emails steady as the case moved forward. The trust was real, the funds modest but secure, and she was working to transfer them to my name. There was no fortune, no grand windfall, but that wasn't the point. It was my father's last act of faith in me, a gift I hadn't known I'd needed until it was there. I'd lie awake sometimes, the radiator silent in the summer heat, and think about him, about the way he'd carried me on his shoulders, his voice rumbling with stories. "You're my legacy, Margaret," he'd said. And now, decades later, I was living that legacy, not in wealth, but in truth, in courage, in the life I'd built from the ashes of what was taken. I started sharing my story more, not just in writing, but in person. Ruth invited me to a local book club, a small group of women who met in a community center, their faces lined with years and wisdom. I was nervous, my hands sweaty as I stood at the front of the room. But when I started talking about the mansion, about Clara, about the letter, their eyes held mine, soft with recognition. I told them about the summer of '78, the fight that broke us, the way I'd blamed myself for so long. I told them about the trust, about finding my father's love in a document I'd never expected to see. When I finished, the room was quiet, and then a woman named Grace, her hair white, her hands folded in her lap, said, "You've given me hope, Margaret. I lost my family to secrets too. Maybe it's not too late to find my way back." I nodded, my throat tight, and felt a purpose I hadn't known I could have. Not to fix anyone, but to stand with them, to say, "You're not alone." The book club led to more invitations, libraries, senior centers, even a small radio show where I sat in a cramped studio, the microphone too close, and talked about resilience, about how pain can be a teacher if you let it. I wasn't a celebrity, not even close, but I didn't need to be. Every nod, every hand that reached for mine, every quiet thank you after a talk was enough. I thought about my students, the ones I'd taught over the years, their essays full of dreams and doubts. I'd always told them to look for the human in history, the heart behind the facts. Now, I was living that, sharing my heart, my history, and finding it mattered. But there were still moments when the past pressed close, its edges sharp. One humid August evening, I was watering my herbs, the city buzzing below, when I found an old letter in a drawer, one I'd forgotten about. It was from Clara, written years before her confession, back when I was still teaching, still hoping we could mend things. "Margaret," it read, "I'm sorry we don't talk. Life's complicated, but I miss you." I stood there, the watering can heavy in my hand, and felt a pang of what could have been. I remembered a moment from when I was 13, sitting on Clara's bed, watching her pack for college. She'd been excited, her eyes bright, but she'd stopped to hug me, her arms tight. "We'll always be sisters, Maggie," she'd said. I'd believed her then, but life had other plans. I didn't cry, but I sat on the couch, the letter in my lap, and let the grief come. Not for Clara, not exactly, but for the sisterhood we'd lost, for the years we'd spent apart, for the woman she might have been if she hadn't chosen greed. I thought about my mother, her hands shaking as she poured tea, her voice saying, Asterisk. You keep going. I thought about my father, his pipe, his trust. They'd all shaped me, but so had Clara in her own way. Her betrayal had broken me, but it had also pushed me to find my strength, to build a life that was mine, not defined by what she'd taken. The second twist came in September, quiet but profound, like a sunrise you don't notice until it's bright. Ellen called me one morning, her voice calm but warm. "Margaret," she said, "we've settled the claim. The trust is yours, and there's a small piece of land, too. A parcel Clara never sold. It's not much, just a few acres, but it's in your name now." I stood in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, my coffee cooling on the counter. Land. My father's land. The farm he'd loved. The heart of his legacy. I didn't know what to say, so I just thanked her, my voice thick and hung up. The apartment so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I drove to the land the next weekend. A clear autumn day, the sky wide and blue. It was just outside the city. A small patch of earth surrounded by fields, the grass golden in the sunlight. I parked my car, my boots sinking into the soft ground, and walked to the center, the air sweet with clover and dirt. I closed my eyes, the wind cool against my face, and saw my father there, his hands in the soil, his smile wide. "This is yours, Margaret," he'd said. And now, after all these years, it was. I didn't plan to build on it, didn't need to own it in that way. It was enough to stand there, to feel him, to know I'd honored his trust. I went back to the city that night, the stars bright above the highway, my apartment waiting like an old friend. I sat at my table, the memoir open, and wrote about the land, about the trust, about the love that had outlasted betrayal. The past was still there, its shadow soft now, not heavy, but part of me, like the lines on my face, the grey in my hair. I was Margaret, 62, a teacher, a writer, a woman who'd faced her ghosts and found her strength, not in anger, but in truth, in love, in the quiet act of claiming her own story. Fall painted the city in hues of amber and crimson, the leaves crunching under my boots as I walked to the cafe each morning. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, and I'd sit by the window, my coffee steaming, my notebook open to a new page. The memoir was nearly finished now, its chapters a tapestry of the mansion, my family, and the woman I'd become. I'd write until the lunch crowd arrived, their voices a soft hum, and feel a quiet pride, not in the words themselves, but in the act of telling, of giving shape to a past that had once felt too heavy to hold. I was 62, and life wasn't just something I lived anymore. It was something I shaped, something I claimed, one story at a time. The trust money came through in October, a modest sum deposited into my account, enough to pay off my car, take a trip, maybe fix the leaky faucet I'd been ignoring. I didn't touch it right away. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, the check from Ellen's office in front of me, and thought about my father, about the land he'd loved, about the legacy he'd wanted for me. I remembered a moment from when I was 9, sitting in his study, the air thick with pipe smoke. He'd been reading, his glasses low on his nose, and I'd been drawing, my crayons scattered across his desk. "What do you want to be, Margaret?" he'd asked, his voice gentle. I'd shrugged, shy, and said, "Happy." He'd laughed, his eyes crinkling, and said, "That's the best answer I've ever heard." I hadn't understood then, but now, holding that check, I did. Happiness wasn't a place or a thing. It was a choice, one I'd made over and over despite everything. I decided to use the money for something meaningful, not for myself, but for others. I called Ruth, who'd been volunteering at a local community center, and asked about their programs. They needed books, she said, for a literacy group for older women, many of whom had never had the chance to learn. I thought about my mother, her hands shaking as she read the newspaper, her education cut short by a marriage that demanded too much. I thought about my students, their faces bright with questions, their futures open because someone had taught them to read, to think, to dream. I wrote a check to the center, enough to buy books and fund a tutor for a year, and dropped it off the next day, my heart full as Ruth hugged me, her scarf bright against the gray of the city. The land, that small parcel of my father's farm, stayed with me too. I didn't visit often. It was enough to know it was there, green and quiet, a piece of him I could carry in my heart. But one weekend, I drove out with Ruth, the sky clear, the fields golden under the autumn sun. We walked the perimeter, the grass brushing our ankles, and I told her about my father, about the stories he'd told, about the trust he'd hidden for me. She listened, her hands in her pockets, her eyes soft. "You've done him proud, Margaret," she said, her voice steady. "Not just with this land, but with you, with your life." I nodded, my throat tight, and felt a peace I hadn't known I was searching for, like a knot in my chest finally loosening. The memoir was accepted for publication in November, a small press with a reputation for honest, heartfelt stories. The editor, a woman named Lila, called me one morning, her voice warm over the phone. "Your book is special, Margaret," she said. "It's not just a story. It's a hand reaching out to anyone who's ever had to rebuild." I sat on my couch, the phone pressed to my ear, and felt tears come. Not sad, but full, like rain after a long drought. I thought about Clara, about the letter, about the sister I'd loved and lost. I thought about my mother, her silence, her strength. I thought about my father, his trust, his love. They were all in those pages, but so was I. Margaret, the dreamer, the fighter, the woman who'd found her way. The book wouldn't come out for another year, but the process was already changing me. I worked with Lila on edits, my kitchen table covered in drafts, my coffee cold as I lost myself in revisions. I'd read the chapters aloud to Ruth, to the book club, their feedback sharpening the words, making them truer. I'd sit on my balcony at night, the city lights blinking below, the locket warm against my skin, and think about the women who'd read my story, the ones who'd see themselves in it. I wasn't writing for fame or money. I was writing for them, for the Grace who'd lost her family to secrets, for the students who'd dreamed bigger because I'd believed in them, for the girl I'd been, who'd needed someone to tell her she was enough. There were still moments when the past slipped in, quiet but insistent. One cold December evening, I was sorting through old photos, the apartment warm with the smell of soup simmering on the stove. I found a picture of Clara, taken years after the mansion, at some fancy event, her dress sleek, her smile polished. I sat there, the photo in my hand, and felt a pang. Not anger, not grief, but a kind of sadness, soft and heavy for the woman she'd become. I remembered a moment from when I was 16, after the fight that broke us, standing in the mansion's foyer watching her pack her car. She'd looked at me, her eyes hard, and said, "You'll be fine, Margaret. You always are." I'd wanted to scream, to beg her to stay, but I'd just nodded, my hands clenched, and let her go. Now, holding that photo, I wished I could tell her I was fine, not because I had to be, but because I'd chosen to be. I put the photo away, not in anger, but in peace, and went back to my soup, stirring it slowly, the steam curling in the light. The past was there, its lessons deep, but it wasn't my prison anymore. I was free, not because I'd won, not because I'd gotten everything back, but because I'd found what mattered, my voice, my truth, my heart. I thought about my mother, her hands guiding mine through dough. Her voice sang, "Asterisk, you keep going." I thought about my father, his pipe, his trust. I thought about Clara, her letter, her choices. They were all part of me, but they weren't all of me. I was Margaret, 62, a woman who'd faced her ghosts and come out whole. Not by fighting, but by loving, by choosing herself day after day. Winter settled in, the city quiet under a blanket of snow. I kept writing, kept speaking, kept living. The book club threw a small party for my book deal, their laughter filling the community center, their glasses raised in a toast. Ruth gave a speech, her voice steady, calling me a survivor, a storyteller, a friend. I smiled, my throat tight, and felt a gratitude so deep it was almost physical. These people, this life, they'd held me up when I couldn't hold myself, and I'd carry them with me always. Sometimes I'd think about the mansion, its chandelier flickering, its shadows long. It wasn't a place of pain anymore, but a place of beginning, where I'd learned to dream, to fight, to love. I'd stand on my balcony, the city humming below, the stars faint but there, and feel a quiet triumph, not loud or flashy, but deep, like a river running steady. The past was mine, not to carry, but to honor, to weave into a life that was full, not because it was perfect, but because it was true. I was home, in myself, in the story I'd told, ready for whatever came next, my heart open, my steps sure. The snow fell steadily that winter, blanketing the city in a hush that made every sound, the creak of a door, the hum of a heater, feel intimate, like a secret shared. I'd walk to the cafe in the mornings, my scarf tucked tight, my boots leaving prints in the fresh powder, and feel a quiet joy in the routine. The barista, a young woman with a nose ring and a quick smile, would slide my coffee across the counter, black with a splash of milk, and I'd settle by the window, my notebook open, the memoir's final chapters taking shape. I was 62, and life felt like a book I was still writing. Each day a new page, each moment a chance to choose what came next. The memoir was almost ready to send to Lila, the editor, its pages a map of my heart, the mansion, my family, the betrayal, the trust, the woman I'd become. I'd write in the evenings, the apartment warm, the herbs on the windowsill curling toward the light. I wrote about the small things that had saved me, the smell of my mother's bread, the weight of my father's hand on my shoulder, the sound of Ruth's laugh over coffee. I wrote about Clara, not as a villain, but as a sister, flawed and human, whose choices had broken us, but also pushed me to find my strength. The words weren't always easy, but they were true, and that was enough. Ruth was my anchor through the process, her feedback sharp but gentle, her belief in me unwavering. We'd meet at the community center, where she still volunteered, and sit in the cramped office, papers scattered between us. "You're doing something brave, Margaret," she'd say, her glasses slipping down her nose. "Not just for you, but for everyone who reads this." I'd nod, my throat tight, and think about my mother, her hands shaking as she poured tea, her voice saying, "Asterisk, you keep going." I thought about my students, their essays full of hope and fear, their lives shaped by the stories they'd been told and the ones they'd yet to tell. I was writing for them too, for anyone who'd ever felt their story didn't matter. The trust money was a quiet presence, a gift I was still learning to hold, still learning. I'd used most of it for the community center's literacy program, but I kept a small amount, enough for a trip I'd always wanted to take, to the coast where my father had grown up, where the land he'd loved had first taken root in his heart. I planned it for spring, a solo journey, not to escape, but to connect, to feel him in the salt air, the crash of waves, the stretch of horizon. I'd lie awake sometimes, the city quiet outside, and imagine standing on that shore, the wind in my hair, my locket warm against my skin. It wasn't about closure, not exactly, but about carrying him forward, about living the legacy he'd left me. The speaking engagements continued, each one a chance to share my story, to listen to others. I spoke at a senior center one snowy afternoon, the room full of faces lined with years, their eyes bright with recognition as I talked about the mansion, about Clara, about rebuilding. A man named Henry, his hands gnarled from decades of carpentry, waited until the end to approach me. "My brother took everything," he said, his voice low. "Our family's business, our father's name. I let it go. But hearing you, maybe I can still claim something back." I took his hand, his skin rough against mine, and said, "You can. It's never too late." He nodded, his eyes wet, and I felt a purpose so deep, it was almost sacred, not to fix, but to witness, to stand with someone in their truth. There were moments, though, when the past slipped in, soft but heavy like snow piling up unnoticed. One cold January evening, I was sorting through my closet, looking for a scarf, when I found a box I'd forgotten about. Inside was a journal, one I'd kept in my 20s, its pages yellowed, its ink faded. I sat on the floor, the apartment quiet except for the radiator's hum, and read my own words, angry, lost, full of questions about Clara, about why she'd left me, about what I'd done wrong. I remembered writing it, sitting in a tiny apartment, the walls thin, the city loud outside. I'd been teaching then, my days full of lesson plans and grading, my nights full of doubt. I'd felt so small, so invisible, like the world had moved on without me. I closed the journal, my chest tight, and thought about that girl, the one who'd written those words. I wished I could reach back, take her hand, tell her she was enough, that she'd find her way. I thought about my mother, her hands guiding mine through dough, her voice saying, "Asterisk, you keep going." I thought about my father, his pipe, his trust. They'd believed in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself, and that belief had carried me here, to this apartment, this life, this story. I put the journal away, not in a box, but on my bookshelf, next to the memoir drafts, a reminder of how far I'd come. The final twist came in February, quiet but shattering, like ice breaking on a river. Lila called me one morning, her voice hesitant, not her usual warmth. "Margaret," she said, "we got a letter at the press addressed to you. It's from Clara's daughter, Emily." I froze, my coffee mug halfway to my lips, the apartment suddenly too small. Clara's daughter. I'd known she existed. Clara had mentioned her in one of her early letters, a baby born in the 80s. But we'd never met, never spoken. She was a stranger, a piece of my sister I'd never known how to reach. "She read your manuscript," Lila continued. "She wants to meet you." I sat down, my legs unsteady, and felt the past rush in, not as pain but as possibility. Emily, Clara's child, my niece, a woman now, carrying her mother's story and mine. I thought about Clara, her letter, her confession. I thought about the mansion, the fireflies, the sister I'd loved. I thought about my father, his trust, his hope for me. Meeting Emily wasn't about fixing the past. It was about building something new, something true, from the pieces we'd been left. I told Lila to send me the letter, my voice calm but my heart racing, and hung up, the city quiet outside, the snow still falling. Emily's letter arrived the next day, handwritten, its words careful but warm. "Aunt Margaret," it began, "I read your book and it broke my heart, but it also gave me hope. I didn't know my mother the way you did, but I want to know you. I want to understand our family, what happened, what we can be. I read it at my kitchen table, the lamp casting a soft glow, and felt tears come, not for what was lost, but for what might be found. I wrote back, my pen steady, and invited her to the city, to my apartment, to a conversation I'd never thought I'd have. She came a week later, a woman in her 30s, her eyes like Clara's but softer, her smile hesitant but real. We sat on my couch, tea steaming between us, and talked, not just about Clara, but about her life, my life, the family we'd both lost. She told me about her mother's regrets, her silence in her final years, her love for me buried under guilt. I told her about the mansion, the trust, the memoir. We cried, laughed, sat in silence. And when she left, her hug was tight, like Clara's had been all those years ago. "I'm glad you're my aunt," she said, her voice thick, and I nodded, my heart full, knowing I'd found something I hadn't known I was missing. Spring came, the city waking in bursts of green, the snow melting into rivers that ran along the curbs. I finished the memoir, sent it to Lila, and stood on my balcony, the herbs fragrant, the locket warm against my skin. I thought about the mansion, its shadows, its truths. I thought about Clara, Emily, my parents, the girl I'd been. They were all there, in me, but so was this Margaret, the one who'd written her story, who'd found her family, who'd claimed her legacy, not in wealth, but in love, in truth, in the quiet triumph of living. The city hummed below, alive and endless, and I was part of it, my heart open, my story whole, ready for whatever came next. Spring unfolded slowly, the city softening under a haze of green, the air sweet with blooming trees, and the promise of longer days. I'd walk to the cafe each morning, my notebook tucked under my arm, the locket around my neck a steady weight against my chest. The memoir was with Lila now, in the final stages of editing, its pages a testament to the life I'd lived, the mansion, the betrayal, the trust, the family I'd found in Emily. I was 62, and the world felt wide open, not in a grand, youthful way, but in a quiet, grounded one, like a field after rain, ready for whatever seeds I chose to plant. Emily's visit had changed something in me, not a seismic shift, but a gentle one, like a window left open to let in fresh air. We'd started writing to each other, not often, but enough. Letters about her life in Seattle, her work as a social worker, her memories of Clara. She'd send photos sometimes, of her apartment, her dog, a sunset over the water, and I'd smile, tucking them into a drawer with the picture of Clara and me in the mansion's garden. I'd write back, telling her about the city, the memoir, the herbs on my windowsill, and it felt like building a bridge, not to the past, but to a future we could share. I thought about my father, his pipe smoke curling in the air, his voice saying, "You're my legacy, Margaret." I'd always thought he meant the land, the money, but now I saw it differently. His legacy was love, connection, the family I was reclaiming, one letter at a time. The community center became a second home, its fluorescent lights and chipped tables, a contrast to the city's polish, but warm with purpose. I volunteered there now, helping with the literacy program I'd funded, sitting with women whose hands were worn from years of work, their eyes bright as they sounded out words. I thought about my mother every time, her hands guiding mine through dough, her voice soft with resignation. These women were like her, strong in ways they didn't always see, and I'd listen to their stories, divorces, losses, quiet triumphs, feeling a kinship that went beyond words. One woman, Rosa, who'd come from Guatemala decades ago, hugged me after a session, her arms tight. "You make me believe I can do this," she said, her accent thick but her words clear. I smiled, my throat tight, and thought, "You're doing it already." Ruth was there too, her scarf a splash of color against the center's drab walls, her laugh a constant in the chaos. We'd sit in the office after sessions, sharing tea from a thermos, talking about the memoir, the women, the lives we'd lived. "You're different, Margaret," she said one afternoon, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "Not louder, not bigger, just surer, like you know who you are." I nodded, stirring my tea, and thought about the mansion, the letter, the trust. I'd spent so long feeling like a piece of me was missing, but now I saw it. I'd been whole all along, just waiting to claim it. The memoir's publication was set for the fall, and Lila sent me mock-ups of the cover. A simple image of a field under a stormy sky, the light breaking through. It was perfect, not flashy, but true, like the story itself. I'd sit on my balcony at night, the city lights blinking below, and imagine the book in someone's hands, its pages turned by a woman like Rosa, like Grace, like me. I wasn't writing for fame. I'd never wanted that, but for the quiet nod of recognition, the moment when someone read my words and thought, "I'm not alone." I thought about my students, their essays full of dreams, their questions about history, about life. I'd told them stories mattered, and now I was living that, my story a light for someone else's path. But the past was never far, its echoes soft but persistent. One warm June evening, I was watering my herbs, the city buzzing below, when I found an old postcard in a book, one Clara had sent years ago, before the silence between us grew too wide. It was from Paris, a picture of the Eiffel Tower, her handwriting quick and bright. "Maggie," it read, "this city is magic. Wish you were here." I stood there, the watering can heavy in my hand, and felt a pang, not sharp like it used to be, but tender, like pressing a bruise that's almost healed. I remembered a moment from when I was 14, sitting on the mansion's porch, Clara teaching me to braid my hair. "You're gonna break hearts, Maggie," she'd said, her laugh warm, her hands gentle. I'd believed her, believed in her, until I didn't. Now, holding that postcard, I wished I could tell her I'd found my own magic. Not in Paris, but in myself, in the life I'd built. I kept the postcard, not in a box, but on my fridge, a reminder of the sister I'd loved, the one who'd existed before greed took her. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but acceptance, a way of letting her be part of me without letting her define me. I thought about my mother, her hands shaking as she poured tea, her voice saying, "Asterisk, you keep going." I thought about my father, his pipe, his trust. They'd given me the strength to keep going, and Clara, in her own way, had too. Her betrayal had broken me, but it had also taught me to rebuild, to choose myself, to stand tall. The trip to the coast came in July, a week of quiet, just me and the sea. I drove to the town where my father had grown up, a small place with salt-weathered houses and a shore that stretched forever. I rented a cottage, its windows open to the crash of waves, and spent my days walking the beach, the sand cool under my feet, the wind tangling my hair. I'd stand at the water's edge, the locket warm against my skin, and feel my father there, his love steady, unbroken by time. I thought about the land, that small parcel I'd visited with Ruth, and saw it now as part of this place, this earth he'd loved. I didn't need to own it. I needed to live it, to carry its heart in mine. One evening, I sat on the cottage's porch, a glass of wine in my hand, the sky awash of pink and gold. I wrote in my notebook, not for the memoir, but for me, a letter to my father, to my mother, to Clara. to the girl I'd been. "I'm here," I wrote. "I'm whole. Thank you for teaching me, even when it hurt." I closed the notebook, the stars coming out, and felt a peace so deep it was almost holy. I was 62, my hair gray, my hands lined, but I was alive. More alive than I'd ever been, my heart open to the world, to the family I'd found, to the story I was still writing. Back in the city, life moved forward, the memoir's release drawing closer, the community center buzzing with new students, Emily's letters a steady thread in my days. I'd walk to the cafe, my notebook full, my locket a quiet weight, and feel a triumph not loud or grand, but deep like a river running steady. The mansion was a memory now, its shadows soft, its lessons carved into me like lines in a tree. I'd stood in its ruins and come out stronger, not by fighting, but by loving, by choosing truth, by claiming my story. The city stretched out before me, alive and endless, and I was part of it, my heart sure, my steps light, ready for whatever came next, knowing I'd meet it as myself, whole and free. Summer faded into fall, the city settling into a rhythm of cool mornings and golden afternoons, the leaves piling along the curbs, like memories waiting to be swept away. I'd walk to the cafe each day, my coat unbuttoned, the locket around my neck catching the light, and feel a quiet certainty, like I'd finally found the ground beneath my feet. The memoir was in its final stages, the proofs arriving in a thick envelope, their pages heavy with my story. The mansion, Clara, the trust, Emily, the woman I'd become. I was 62 and life wasn't something I was chasing anymore. It was something I held, something I shaped, something that felt like home. The community center was bustling, the literacy program growing with new faces, women whose stories echoed my own, mothers, daughters, survivors, all learning to read, to write, to claim their voices. I'd sit with them in the evenings, the fluorescent lights humming, and guide their hands through letters, their pencils scratching softly against paper. Rosa was reading short stories now, her smile wide as she sounded out words, her pride a light I could feel across the room. "You're my teacher, Margaret," she'd say, her accent warm, her eyes bright. I'd shake my head smiling and think about my own teachers, my mother, her hands kneading dough, my father, his pipe smoke curling, even Clara, whose betrayal had taught me resilience in ways I'd never expected. I was teaching, yes, but I was learning too, about strength, about connection, about the power of a story told true. Ruth was my constant, her presence steady as we worked side by side at the center. We'd share coffee in the office, the thermos steaming, and talk about the memoir, the women, the lives we'd lived. "You've built something, Margaret," she said one afternoon, her scarf a splash of red against the gray of the room. "Not just a book, but a legacy." I stirred my coffee, the spoon clinking, and thought about my father, his voice saying, "You're my legacy, Margaret." I'd thought he meant the land, the money, but now I saw it was this: love, truth, the way I'd chosen to live, to give, to stand with others in their becoming. The memoir's release was set for October, and the anticipation was a quiet hum in my days. Lila sent me the final cover, the field under a stormy sky, the light breaking through, and I traced it with my finger, my heart full. I'd sit on my balcony at night, the city lights blinking below, the herbs fragrant, and imagine the book in someone's hands. A woman like Rosa, like Grace, like Emily, finding herself in its pages. I thought about my students, their essays full of dreams, their questions about history. I'd told them stories were power, and now I was living that, my story a bridge to others, a way of saying, "You're not alone." But the past was always there. its edges softened but never gone. One crisp September morning, I was sorting through papers, the apartment warm with the smell of baking bread, when I found a letter from my mother, written a year before she died. It was tucked in a book, its envelope yellowed, her handwriting shaky but clear. "Margaret," it read, "I'm sorry I wasn't stronger for you. I knew about Clara, about the will, but I couldn't fight her. You're my dreamer, and I'm so proud of you. Keep going." I sat at my kitchen table, the bread forgotten, and felt tears come, not sharp but deep, like rain soaking into earth. I remembered a moment from when I was 10, sitting in her garden, watching her weed the roses. She'd looked at me, her hands dirty, her eyes tired, and said, "You're my light, Margaret." I hadn't understood then, but now, holding her letter, I did. She'd loved me, fought for me in her own quiet way, and that love had carried me here. I kept the letter on my desk, next to the photo of Clara and me, the postcard from Paris, the picture of Emily's dog. They were my history, not a weight, but a foundation, proof of where I'd been and how far I'd come. I thought about Clara, her confession, her daughter. I thought about my father, his trust, his stories. I thought about my mother, her silence, her strength. They'd all shaped me, but I'd shaped myself too, choosing truth over bitterness, love over anger, life over loss. The book launch came on a cool October evening in a small bookstore with creaky floors and shelves that smelled of time. The room was full. Ruth, Rosa, the literacy group, Emily, who'd flown in from Seattle, her smile warm as she hugged me. I stood at the podium, the book in my hands, its weight solid, real. "This is a story about a family," I began, my voice steady, "about what breaks us and what builds us back." I read a chapter, the one about the mansion's foyer, the chandelier flickering, the shadows of my family behind me. The room was quiet, their faces soft with recognition, and when I finished, they clapped. Not loud, but deep, like they'd stood in that foyer with me. Afterward, I signed copies, my pen steady, my heart full. Emily waited until the end, her hands in her pockets, her eyes like Clara's but kinder. "I'm proud of you, Aunt Margaret," she said, her voice thick. "Mom would have been too." I nodded, my throat tight, and hugged her, feeling Clara there, not as pain but as memory, as love. Rosa came too, her book clutched to her chest, and said, "You're my hero." I laughed, shaking my head, but her words stayed with me, a light I carried home. The weeks after the launch were a blur of quiet joys. The book sold modestly, but the letters poured in. Women like me, women like Rosa, women like Emily, sharing their stories, their rebuildings. I kept speaking, at libraries, community centers, a university where my old students, now grown, sat in the audience, their eyes bright with pride. I'd talk about the mansion, the trust, the family I'd found, and see nods, tears, hands reaching for mine. "You've given me courage," a woman said after one talk, her voice soft, her hands worn. I smiled, my heart full, and thought, "You've given me courage too." Winter came again, the city quiet under snow, the days short but bright. I kept volunteering, kept writing, kept living. Emily visited for Christmas, her laughter filling my apartment, her stories of Seattle weaving into mine. We cooked together, the kitchen warm with garlic and herbs, and I thought about my mother, her hands guiding mine, her voice saying, "Asterisk, you keep going." I was going, not just forward, but deeper, into a life that was mine, not defined by what was taken, but by what I'd built. Sometimes I'd think about the mansion, its chandelier, its shadows. It was a place of beginning, where I'd learned to dream, to fight, to love. I'd stand on my balcony, the city humming, the stars faint but there, and feel a triumph, not in winning, but in becoming the woman who could stand here, her story told, her heart whole. The past was mine, not to carry, but to cherish, to weave into a life that shone like the stars I'd once chased. I was Margaret, 62, a dreamer, a teacher, a storyteller, ready for whatever came next. My steps sure, my heart open, my life a legacy of love, truth, and quiet, unshakable strength. Winter tightened its grip on the city, the snow piling high, the air sharp with a cold that settled into your bones. I'd walk to the community center in the evenings, my coat buttoned to my chin, my breath clouding in the streetlight's glow, and feel a warmth despite the chill. The warmth of purpose, of connection, of a life I'd built from the pieces I'd been given. The memoir was out in the world now, its pages finding readers I'd never meet, their letters arriving like gifts, each one a reminder that my story wasn't just mine anymore. I was 62, and life felt like a tapestry, woven with threads of pain and joy, loss and love, each one essential to the whole. The literacy program was thriving, the community center's small room filled with women whose voices grew stronger with every word they read. I'd sit with them, my hands steady as I pointed to a sentence, their pencils scratching, their faces lit with determination. Rosa was writing now, not just reading, short essays about her childhood in Guatemala, her words raw but powerful. "You taught me this, Margaret," she'd say, her smile wide, her hands clutching her notebook. I'd shake my head, my throat tight, and think about my mother, her hands kneading dough, her voice saying, "Asterisk, you keep going." I thought about my students, their essays full of dreams, their questions about history. I'd told them stories were power, and now I saw it in Rosa, in the women around her, in the way they claimed their voices, their lives, their truths. Emily was a steady presence, her letters arriving every few weeks, her words a bridge between us. She'd write about her work, her dog, the small moments that made her days, coffee with a friend, a hike in the rain, a book she'd loved. I'd write back, telling her about the city, the center, the memoir's quiet ripples. We were building something, not just a family, but a trust, a love that Clara's choices couldn't break. I thought about a moment from when I was 12, sitting on the mansion's porch, Clara braiding my hair, her hands gentle, her laugh bright. "We're sisters forever, Maggie," she'd said, and I'd believed her. Now, with Emily, I felt that promise again, not as a weight, but as a gift, a chance to love without losing myself. The memoir's reach grew slowly, its sales modest, but its impact deep. I'd get emails from readers, women mostly, their words echoing my own, stories of betrayal, of rebuilding, of finding strength in the quiet moments. One came from a woman named Helen, in her 70s, who'd lost her home to a family dispute decades ago. "Your book made me feel seen," she wrote, her words careful but raw. "I thought I was too old to start again, but you showed me I'm not." I read it at my kitchen table, the lamp casting a soft glow, and felt tears come, not sad, but full, like I'd given something back to the world, something my mother, my father, even Clara had taught me. The speaking engagements continued, each one a chance to share, to listen, to connect. I spoke at a library one snowy February afternoon, the room small but warm, the windows fogged with breath. I talked about the mansion, the letter, the trust, about how pain can be a teacher if you let it. A woman named Clara, her name a jolt, though her face was kind, approached me after, her hands clasped tight. "My sister took everything," she said, her voice low. "Our parents' savings, their love, I've carried that for years. Your story, It's helping me let it go. I took her hand, her skin warm, and said, "You're letting go for you, not for her." That's the victory. She nodded, her eyes wet, and I felt a purpose so deep it was almost holy, not to fix, but to witness, to stand with someone in their truth. There were moments, though, when the past pressed close, its edges soft but heavy. One cold March evening, I was baking bread, the kitchen warm with yeast and light, when I found an old photo in a drawer, one I hadn't seen in years. It was my parents, young, standing in the mansion's garden, their arms around each other, their smiles bright. I sat at the table, the dough forgotten, and traced their faces, my finger lingering on my mother's eyes, so full of hope. I remembered a moment from when I was 7, sitting in her lap, the air sweet with roses. "You're my dreamer, Margaret," she'd said, her voice soft, her hands warm. I hadn't known then how much she'd lose, how much she'd carry. Now, holding that photo, I wished I could tell her I'd found my dreams, that I'd kept going, that I'd made her proud. I kept the photo on my desk, next to my mother's letter, Clara's postcard, Emily's pictures. They were my history, not a burden, but a foundation, proof of who I was and how far I'd come. I thought about my father, his pipe, his trust. I thought about Clara, her confession, her daughter. I thought about Emily, her letters, her love. They'd all shaped me, but I'd shaped myself too, choosing truth over bitterness, connection over isolation, life over loss. The final moment came in April, a warm spring evening, the city alive with blooming trees and open windows. I'd been invited to speak at a women's conference, a small event in a community hall. The room full of faces, young, old, tired, hopeful. I stood at the podium, the memoir in my hands, and talked about the mansion, about Clara, about the trust, about Emily. I talked about the small moments that had saved me, the locket, the herbs, the letters, the women at the center. "This isn't a story about winning," I said, my voice steady, "but about becoming, about choosing yourself, even when it hurts, even when it's hard." The room was quiet, their eyes holding mine, and when I finished, they clapped, not loud but deep, like they'd walked my path with me. Afterward, a woman approached me, her hair gray, her hands worn. "I'm starting over," she said, her voice soft. "Lost my home, my marriage, everything. Your book gave me hope." I took her hand, her grip strong, and said, "You're not starting over. You're starting new." She smiled, her eyes wet, and I felt a triumph, not in fame or wealth, but in connection, in knowing my story had lit a spark in hers. I walked home that night, the city humming, the stars faint but there. I stood on my balcony, the herbs fragrant, the locket warm against my skin. I thought about the mansion, its chandelier, its shadows. I thought about Clara, Emily, my parents, the girl I'd been. They were all there, in me. But so was this Margaret, the one who'd written her truth, who'd found her family, who'd claimed her legacy, not in land or money, but in love, in purpose, in the quiet strength of living. The past was mine, not to carry but to cherish, to weave into a life that shone like the stars I'd once dreamed of. I was 63 now, my hair gray, my hands lined, but I was alive, my heart open, my story whole, ready for whatever came next, knowing I'd meet it as myself, free and sure. The city bloomed into summer, the air thick with heat and the scent of blooming jasmine, the streets alive with the chatter of open windows and the laughter of kids playing in the park. I'd walk to the community center each evening, my sandals soft against the pavement, the locket around my neck a familiar weight, its silver warmed by the sun. The memoir was out in the world, its quiet ripples spreading, letters from readers, invitations to speak, moments when someone would stop me in the cafe, their eyes bright and say, "Your book changed me." I was 63, and life felt like a garden I'd tended through storms and seasons, its roots deep, its flowers vivid, each one a testament to the woman I'd become. The literacy program at the community center was a heartbeat, steady and strong. I'd sit with the women under the fluorescent lights, their notebooks open, their voices growing bolder with every word they wrote. Rosa had finished her first short story, a piece about her mother's kitchen in Guatemala, the air thick with spices and love. She read it to the group one evening, her hands trembling but her voice clear, and when she finished, the room erupted in applause, her smile brighter than the sun. "You did this, Margaret," she said, hugging me, her notebook clutched to her chest. I shook my head, my throat tight, and thought about my own mother, her hands guiding mine through dough, her voice saying, "Asterisk, you keep going." Rosa was going, and so was I, our stories intertwined, our strength shared. Emily was a constant now, her visits more frequent, her laughter filling my apartment like light. She'd come for a weekend in June, her dog trailing behind her, and we'd cook together, the kitchen warm with garlic and herbs, the windows open to the city's hum. We talked about Clara, not as a wound, but as a memory, a woman who'd loved us both in her flawed human way. "I wish I'd known you sooner," Emily said one night, her wineglass catching the lamplight, her eyes like Clara's but softer. I smiled, my heart full, and said, "We're here now." I thought about a moment from when I was 15, standing in the mansion's garden, Clara chasing fireflies with me, her laugh bright against the dusk. That girl was gone, but her echo lived in Emily, in the family we were building, one moment at a time. The memoir's impact grew, not in sales, though they were steady, but in the lives it touched. I'd get letters from women across the country, their words raw, their stories echoing mine. Sisters who'd betrayed, parents who'd failed, legacies lost and found. One came from a woman named Ruth, not my Ruth, but another in her 80s, who'd read the book in a nursing home. "I thought my story was over," she wrote, her handwriting shaky, "but you showed me it's not. I'm writing now for my grandkids so they know who I was." I read it on my balcony, the city lights blinking below, and felt tears come, not sad but deep, like I'd given something to the world, something my father, my mother, even Clara had planted in me. The speaking engagements were a rhythm, each one a chance to share, to listen, to connect. I spoke at a university in July, a room full of students and professors, my old colleagues among them, their faces proud. I talked about the mansion, the letter, the trust, about how love can outlast betrayal if you choose it. A student, barely 20, asked, "How do you forgive someone who hurt you so much?" I paused, the locket warm against my skin, and thought about Clara, about Emily, about myself. "You don't always forgive for them," I said, my voice steady. "You forgive for you, to be free." The room nodded, their eyes holding mine, and I felt a purpose so deep it was almost sacred, not to teach, but to witness, to stand with others in their truth. There were moments when the past slipped in, soft as a breeze, heavy as memory. One warm August evening, I was sorting through books, the apartment quiet, except for the hum of a fan, when I found a journal my father had kept, its leather cover cracked, its pages brittle. I sat on the couch, the lamplight soft, and read his words, notes about the farm, the mansion, his dreams for me. "Margaret is my heart," he'd written, his handwriting bold. She'll carry this land, this love, further than I ever could. I closed the journal, my chest tight, and thought about a moment from when I was 9, sitting on his shoulders, the garden stretching out below. "You're my legacy, Margaret," he'd said, his voice rumbling. I hadn't understood then, but now, holding his words, I did. I'd carried his love, not in land or money, but in myself, in the life I'd built, in the stories I'd told. I kept the journal on my desk, next to my mother's letter, Claire's postcard, Emily's photos, Rosa's story. They were my roots, not a weight, but a foundation, proof of who I was and how far I'd come. I thought about the mansion, its chandelier flickering, its shadows long. It was a place of beginning, where I'd learned to dream, to fight, to love. I thought about Clara, her confession, her daughter. I thought about Emily, her laughter, her trust. I thought about my parents, their hands, their hopes. They'd all shaped me, but I'd shaped myself too, choosing truth over bitterness, connection over isolation, life over loss. The final moment came on a golden September afternoon, the city alive with the hum of fall, the air cool and bright. I'd been invited to speak at a small literary festival, a tent set up in a park, the grass soft under folding chairs. The crowd was mixed, young writers, older readers, families picnicking nearby, their laughter drifting in. I stood at the microphone, the memoir in my hands, its cover worn from carrying it everywhere. "This is a story about a house," I began, my voice clear, "but it's really about a heart, mine, and maybe yours." I read a chapter, the one about standing in the mansion's foyer, the letter trembling in my hands, the shadows of my family behind me. The crowd was quiet, their faces soft, and when I finished, they clapped, not loud, but deep, like they'd stood in that foyer with me. Afterward, a woman approached, her hair white, her hands clutching a copy of the book. "I lost my sister too," she said, her voice soft, "not to betrayal, but to time. Your story helped me say goodbye." I took her hand, her grip warm, and said, "You're saying hello to yourself now. That's what matters." She smiled, her eyes wet, and I felt a triumph, not in fame or wealth, but in connection, in knowing my story had helped her find hers. I walked home that evening, the city glowing under a sunset of pink and gold, the stars just beginning to show. I stood on my balcony, the herbs fragrant, the locket warm against my skin, and looked out at the city, its lights a constellation of lives, each one a story. I thought about the mansion, its shadows, its truths. I thought about Clara, Emily, my parents, the girl I'd been. They were all there, in me. But so was this Margaret, the one who'd written her heart, who'd found her family, who'd claimed her legacy, not in what was taken, but in what she'd built. The past was mine, not to carry, but to cherish, to weave into a life that shone like the stars I'd once dreamed of. I closed my eyes, the city's hum a lullaby, and felt a peace so deep it was almost holy. I was 63, my hair grey, my hands lined, but I was alive, my heart open, my story whole. The mansion was a memory, its lessons carved into me like lines in a tree, proof of growth, of survival, of love. Not for a family lost, but for the one I'd found, for the woman I'd become. The city stretched out before me, not a place of ruins, but a place of bloom, and I was part of it. My story woven into its light, my future unwritten but ready, waiting for me to live it one brave, quiet step at a time.